Hello, and welcome to today's special event, Can We Adapt to a Changing Climate?, presented in partnership between the British Museum and the Royal Society. My name is Jago Cooper, and I'm the head of the Americas here at the British Museum, as well as one of the curators of the current Citi exhibition, Arctic Culture and Climate. Whilst the COVID-19 pandemic has sadly forced the doors of the exhibition to close, we're still really glad to be able to continue this online programme of free events and discussions around the key themes raised by the exhibition. In the case of today's discussion, we're focused on the pressures of climate change and how we might, using insights from science and history, try and adapt to it in the future. Chaired by journalist and former climate change editor at Nature, Dr. Gabrielle Walker, today's panel includes polar and paleoclimate expert Professor Eric Wolff, environmental journalist, broadcaster and Royal Society Insight Science Book Prize shortlistee Gaia Vince, and an archaeologist of Alaskan Indigenous sites, Dr Rick Knecht. And so, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr Walker and all of our esteemed panel. Dr Walker, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jago, and welcome to everybody here. Good evening. Welcome to the event, Can We Adapt to a Changing Climate? A British Museum event in partnership, of course, with the Royal Society. And this event is part of the public programme, as Jago was just describing, accompanying the Citi exhibition Arctic Culture and Climate at the British Museum. You can take a virtual tour of the exhibition on the British Museum website, and I heartily recommend it, even though we can't actually, sadly, now go there in person. Now, this evening's event will explore stories of climate adaptation from humanity's past and discuss the changes we're currently experiencing in the context of that, looking at the importance of adaptation to climate change, both now and in the future. You just heard from Jago. We have a fantastic panel joining us from tonight's discussions, including a few old friends of mine, and I'm really excited to hear what they have to say. Before we go into that, we will have live captioning available this evening, and if you want to see them, please click on the subtitles or the closed captions button in the bottom bar. And if you'd like to tweet during this event, please use the hashtag Arctic Exhibition. Now, I'm Gabrielle Walker, and I've been working on climate change for several decades now, and also have a closet fascination with the Arctic and Antarctic regions. I've written about it quite extensively and have been told that I sometimes have something of an ice obsession. And so this event this evening is putting together two of the things that are closest to my heart. And that's one of the reasons that I'm here today. I'm going to ask our wonderful panel to introduce themselves each in turn and say a bit more about who they are and why they're interested in this topic of adapting to climate, especially with an Arctic bent. So Eric, Professor Eric Wolff FRS, over to you.
Okay, well, I'm also an ice enthusiast. I spent my whole career studying past climate from ice cores, more in the Antarctic than the Arctic, but we learn a lot about climate change from the Antarctic. So I guess my focus has generally been on looking at the large climate changes that you get as you go through glacial cycles, so what we colloquially call ice ages, like the one we came out of around 15,000 years ago. Which are really large climate changes that rather small human populations no doubt had to do something about, either migrate, adapt or die. You'll all have seen it in the Ice Age film, so you know exactly what they were doing. And then the more modest changes that we've had during the last 10,000 years, which are now culminating in what we're expecting in the next few decades. So I think adaptation is, I think we're all interested in adaptation simply because and I'm sure we'll come on to it later, there is climate change. There's always climate change, but there's more of it at the moment, and there's going to be more of it. And however much we do, there's going to be some climate change to adapt to. And from my own point of view, of course, the ice sheets, there's going to be a lot of sea level change to adapt to unless we do something pretty fast. I think that's probably enough for my introduction, Gabrielle. So.
Okay, thanks very much, Eric. That was perfect. And now Gaia Vince.
Hello. So I'm fascinated with human systems and how humans interact with our planetary environment and how the human systems have changed the planetary and are changing the planetary environment, and how the planetary environment itself imposes changes on human systems. So I've journeyed around the world looking at small communities living very closely to the front lines of these environmental changes, and looked at how they're adapting and innovating, and yes, and how they're migrating away, or how they are changing their local environment, and now, of course, we're all changing our region, our planetary environment. So my interest really is how this incredible creature that is the human being, the human species, has become so successful that it is now dominating Earth systems and pushing us into this Anthropocene, and what sort of Anthropocene we're creating, and how we're going to survive it as a civilization, I suppose, rather than as small hunter-gatherer communities, which we're not anymore, largely, except in the Arctic, of course. Anyway, more of that later. Lovely to be here tonight.
Lovely, thanks very much, Gaia. And then finally, Dr. Rick Knecht, why are you here and what do you do?
I'm an archaeologist at the University of Aberdeen, and I've worked and lived on the Bering Sea and Pacific coast of Alaska for nearly 40 years now. And my interest in climate change is twofold. First, that climate change is essential for understanding the archaeological record in the North. But I'm also concerned with the way that global warming has impacted archaeological sites. Since 2009, I've been part of a team working with the indigenous Yupik village of Quinhagak in Alaska to save what we can from a 500-year-old village that's melting out of the permafrost there and being washed out to sea. And so far, we've rescued more than 100,000 artifacts preserved until now by the ice, and these are being stored at the museum right there in Quinhagak. So we've found a way to save one site, but sadly, thousands of others are being destroyed before we ever get a chance to see them.
Thanks very much, Rick, and thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight. We are here to talk about adaptation, and we already heard 3 different perspectives on that from our 3 panelists. But first, before we go into adaptation in any more detail, I just wanted to touch on something that Eric brought up right at the beginning, which is why would we be talking about adaptation? Surely, whenever I bring up adaptation, I often hear the question, shouldn't we be trying to stop climate change rather than just adapt to it? Isn't that giving up? So why do we actually need to adapt in the first place? And Eric, I was thinking maybe you might want to start with that.
Okay, thank you. Well, I mean, firstly, absolutely, we want to stop as much climate change as possible. But I mean, climate does always change, and we've always had to adapt to changing climate. Normally it changes a bit more slowly than we're expecting it to change now because of anthropogenic climate change. And the issue is, so I think there are different levels of climate change we should talk about. There's climate change, there's anthropogenic climate change, and there's dangerous climate change. Yeah. And I think we're trying to get on a path where we avoid dangerous climate change, but we're certainly going to have some climate change. So we can't, we will have to adapt to it. We've already had 1 degree of global warming, which, because we get an amplified response in the polar regions, is at least 2 degrees in the Arctic. We've baked in quite a bit more, because whatever we do, we're not going to reduce our emissions to zero. I'd be very surprised if we reduce them to zero before 2050, which is already quite a challenging target in most people's minds. And even once we stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere, we've baked in some sea level rise and some ocean warming. So we're going to have some changes to adapt to. I think the critical point is to avoid reaching changes that we can't adapt to. I mean, there may be some, I hate to use the word tipping point, but there may be some tipping points out there in our future that we definitely want to avoid and that probably aren't adaptable to. I mean, if sea level rises by 5 meters, there are some island nations that have gone. If the sea ice all disappears, there are some ways of life in the Arctic that have gone. But nonetheless, we want to avoid as much change as possible, but we're going to have to adapt to whatever's left. If it's going to be warmer, we're going to have to grow different crops or whatever it is.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. I know that John Holdren, who was chief scientific advisor to Barack Obama in the US, he wrote a paper which had a fantastic title, which I think really helps to illuminate this. It was we have to avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable. So avoiding the unmanageable is making sure we don't get to dangerous climate change, stopping it before it gets too bad, before it's too late. And managing the unavoidable is we've already got climate change with us. So what do we actually do about it? And I suppose today's panel is all about managing the unavoidable, right? Rick, you just talked quite powerfully about the experience of being, I mean, you're seeing climate change actually happen in front of you. So these buried artifacts that were buried in ice, and then the ice is melting and the artifacts are disappearing almost in front of your eyes. So you've seen the climate change face to face, right?
I have, and it's frightening because of its speed. You know, we all know that climate change is happening, but having been there for 11 years now, the amount of climate change that we've seen, you know, as visitors and within the community is pretty stunning. What's going on is that permafrost is melting at a good clip, and as it melts, it contributes to sea level rise, and the so much of the land is made of ice that it literally deflates, it literally subsides, and as that happens, the soil has the consistency of bread flour, and it gets undermined by marine waves and so on, and collapses. And since we started working, we've lost about 40 to 50 feet of shoreline. The excavations that we first started back in 2009, 2010 are gone already. And the quality of the soils has changed dramatically. It used to be like we were digging in kind of a wet mud. Now it's as dry as sawdust. It actually gets in our eyes, it blows around. And the weather has changed dramatically. And that's backed up by what we hear from the elders and tradition bearers that we work with. They've seen incredible changes in the kinds of plants and animals and the seasonality and so on. And they're struggling to keep up with that. So I think that's impressed me more than anything else. One of my students up there in Alaska told me that she measures climate change by her pancakes because her house is tilting into the melting tundra, and her pancakes are wedge shaped now on the stove because it's no longer level.
Wow. Gaia, you were just talking to us about this experience of the interaction, about how the Anthropocene, how much we're shaping the environment around us as humans. How do you react to what Rick just said?
I mean, that's incredible, isn't it? Because what you were saying earlier about this dichotomy between mitigation and adaptation, stopping climate change and adapting. Well, you know, we are an adaptive species. We adapt to our environment more perhaps than any other animal. We're incredibly plastic, and we actually emerged in the Pleistocene in an ice world. You know, it was a very different climate, and that's where we spent most of our evolution. And you know, there's been people in the Arctic for tens of thousands of years, for around 30,000 years, if not a little bit more. But what happened, and the last 10 years in which we've built up this huge human, very successful human world, has been this very unusual blip of stable climate. But now it is dramatically changing and pushing people in these vulnerable areas, because the poles experience our global warming much harder and faster than the rest of the world because of various physical reasons to do with the shape and the ice and so on. So they're experiencing climate change that we will experience in the rest of the world much quicker. And already we're seeing huge climate change symptoms all around the world, but particularly in the Arctic. So people are already having to adapt. It's not a case of in the future will they adapt. So you know, that pancake story is so demonstrative of the huge changes we're seeing. We're seeing fires in Siberia. We're seeing the Sami who are trying to herd reindeer can no longer feed on the algae anymore. We're seeing this dramatic erosion of coastlines for Arctic people already. They can't reach their food supplies. They are having to adapt already. This isn't something at some point in the future anymore. It's already happening. If we stopped emitting entirely carbon dioxide, which would be amazing today, if we stopped emitting it today, we'd still not stabilize our warming. Our warming would still increase until at least 2030.
Yeah.
So obviously we need to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions, but we absolutely must and continue to adapt right now, because there isn't a choice. It's not,
Sure.
It's changed. The world has changed.
Sure. And I think, so this is very dramatic. I mean, and certainly I don't think it's just in the Arctic. We are seeing, we'd expect to see climate change come to the Arctic most dramatically and first, for the reasons you were just saying, Gaia, but it does feel as if, with the hurricanes that we're seeing, with the intensity of those storms, with the floods, with the melting of ice, we're actually seeing the effects of climate change everywhere. But I don't think I've ever heard a more powerful, dramatic story, a version of that, than those wedge-shaped pancakes. That's going to haunt me tonight. Thanks, Rick. So we do have to double and redouble our efforts on what we do about stopping climate change, but we also have to figure out what we're going to do to avoid the unmanageable. So let's now start to look at what we know about climate changes in the past and how humans have succeeded in dealing with that, and what we might learn from that. Before we do, I just want to say, as a reminder, please do have your questions come in. And if you have anything to ask, put it in your Q&A of your on the bottom of your screen, and we will be getting to those shortly. So any questions you have for me or the panelists, do bring them along in. Okay, so now here's the question then. First of all, let's pick apart what we know about past climate change. And I'll go to Eric first, because I think let's start with the kind of the really old stuff. It's like going back as far as we can. We know that climate has changed, and we know that it's never been quite as fast as this. But what do we know from the ice actually about past climate changes?
So from the ice, we've got records going back 800,000 years in Antarctica. That's from the Epica project, European program for ice coring in Antarctica, which was 3,000 meters of ice that went back 800,000 years. So what we know from that and from other records is that we go through regular cycles of going in and out of ice ages. So what I mean by an ice age is that there are ice sheets descending over Northern Europe, at times as far as the Wash, more or less across to Birmingham in Britain, and across North America down as far as Wisconsin in the most extreme ice ages. It's also colder everywhere else in those ice ages. So we go in and out of those roughly every 100,000 years in the last 800,000. So that's where much colder temperatures than today. We don't have a lot of analogues in the ice core record for periods that are warmer than today, which is actually a bit of a problem. We've got periods when it was regionally warmer, but not when it was globally warmer. So to go back to somewhere where it's globally warmer, you need to go into things like marine sediments. So about 3 million years ago, when CO2 levels were about the level they're at now, it was quite a lot warmer. There was a lot less ice on Greenland and in Antarctica. And so sea level was higher. And then if you want to go to really warm temperatures, you have to go back much further, maybe 50 million years ago or so, to times when CO2 was much higher than today. So you'll see there's a common theme here, that there's a link in the natural world between CO2 and temperature, which is a worrying thing, because we do know from the past that when CO2 has been high, it's been a warm world, and that's not a coincidence. We understand the physics behind that. The CO2 also goes up and down during these ice ages I was talking about. But again, the fastest rate that we see, there are some century-long jumps of about 10 parts per million. Don't worry about the numbers, but just remember the 10, about 10 parts per million as we came out of the last ice age. That's the fastest we see in the last 800,000 years. We've done 10 parts per million in the last 4 years. So the rate at which we're putting into the atmosphere the things that warm the climate is really phenomenal. It's 2 orders of magnitude higher than what we see in the past 800,000 years.
Yeah, I think I've heard that referred to as being climate change that goes from being a kind of 100,000-year cycle to a 1,000-year cycle to a congressional cycle, just like 4 or 5 years on that time frame. I'm so glad that you brought up Epica, Eric, because this is an extraordinary story. And Greenland and the Arctic also has provided so many of these great ice cores. And I still find it extraordinary that pieces of air from the past get buried into the ice, and that you can actually then drill down in them, bring up the ice, and actually smell air that's never been breathed by humans before. I was actually at Epica when they hit bedrock, visiting Antarctica, so it's got a place that's close to my heart. But all these ice cores from right across Greenland and across the Antarctica have all shown us the same thing, right? That whenever you get pieces of air in the past that had higher CO2, you got higher temperatures, and whenever you had lower CO2, you got lower temperatures. And this thing that you just said, that really there's a lot of examples of when CO2 and temperatures were lower than today, but not really very many where it's higher than today. And that really shows the changes that we're making right now.
Yes, I mean, to go back to places where temperatures were higher than today, you really have to go beyond the ice core record, beyond a million years. I should maybe try and be a bit of a clever dick, and since you mentioned air bubbles, I should change my background to give you some so there's air bubbles in an ice core, but that illustrates what Gabrielle was talking about. The ice cores are such a wonderful archive, because as the snow compresses, you get these bubbles of air that are formed, and you can literally break those bubbles open and measure them as samples of air, just as though you were sticking a tube out of the window today. So that's very powerful. And there is perhaps one other period of time I should talk about that's maybe relevant to this. We have had times during the last ice age when we got very rapid climate changes in Greenland and the Arctic. They're called Danskard-Oeschger events, and they're due to changes in the ocean circulation. So they're, again, colloquially, we sometimes refer to them as, oh, the Gulf Stream turned off. That's a terribly inaccurate description, but the Gulf Stream not bringing warm water to Northern Europe is one of the symptoms of this. So those are periods when climate changed very fast, by 10 degrees in Greenland, maybe 5 degrees in Europe, in a few decades. And one can only imagine what population did in the light of those.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are some data, but that's not my expertise. But my guess is they had to move down fast.
So that's bringing us into a time frame when humans have actually been around. And, you know, if we're talking 800,000 years and beyond, and I'm going to say as a quick aside, since you have those wonderful bubbles behind you, when the Epica ice core did reach the bottom, there was a big celebration while I was there. We actually got some shavings of the old ice that had kind of come off the ice core. They put them in champagne, and we got to have the bubbles of the old air mixing with the bubbles of champagne to celebrate. So that's one of the best celebrations. Scientists really know how to rock. I'd like to point that out. So, and that was really impressive, but it's also sobering and it's important. And now we've got to the part of the story, which is changes that happen rapidly when humans were around in the past, when we weren't such big and complicated civilizations, but when nonetheless we might be able to learn something from what happened then. So would anyone like to comment on that? I mean, Eric, you said it's not your expertise, but you speculated about it. But Guy, you're looking a lot at how humans interact with nature. What can we learn from past behaviors about how we might want to adapt now?
Well, yeah, so I mean, indeed, if we look at the CO2 levels that we're experiencing now, it's been at least 3 million years, so a long, long time before humans were around, or you know, any of our close hominin ancestors were around. And that was a very hot, steamy world. It was very different. There were forests growing up into the Arctic. There were hippos in London. It was a completely different world. Now we have you know, the Holocene world transition, and when there have been past ice ages, so when the sea level rise has come quite rapidly, it has been difficult, but people have been very different. The human system has been very different. What we have now is these huge civilizations. We live in a completely different world. We don't live in small hunter-gatherer populations that can respond quickly. so it is much harder. We have infrastructure, we have we have cities that are vulnerable with millions of people living there. So we're facing something that we have never ever faced as a species before, because we haven't been, in the time that we've been civilized, we've had this incredibly stable climate. So that's the problem, really. The problem is not, and such a huge population, there's nearly 8 billion of us, and our population is rising as the risk rises in parallel. So we need to feed people. Our agriculture is designed, has been bred and grown for a world of the Holocene, with reliable monsoon climate, with temperatures that don't exceed these extreme heat events, without these drought events followed by more drought events, and these very severe El Nino followed by La Nina events, and so on. So that is the problem. If we were a small population of less than 1 billion, and we were less than 1 million, or 5 million, say, and we were living as hunter-gatherers in small groups, we're much more flexible and much more adaptable than we are now.
Sure. We have a question from the audience about population, actually, which is, world human population needs to be reduced, but how? That's not quite an adaptation question, but it has to come in here.
Yeah, so I mean, human population is already slowing. I mean, it's likely to peak now this century, probably around 2060s, and then it's likely to decline, which will bring its own challenges. Because we will have an aging population being supported by a much smaller number of working people. It is rising, and it's likely to peak around 9 to 10 billion. But the problem isn't so much our population. The problem is what type of people we are. We are not living as hunter-gatherers. We are now living in a very, very, we're using far too many resources per person, especially in the rich world. And this really is a rich world problem. But as people develop and require power, start using these very, very big, meaty, dairy-led diets, that's going to be, again, an issue. But these are all challenges which I think we can adapt to. We need to adapt in the rich world just as much as in the poor world.
Any observations about population before we go on again? I'd like to come back to Rick and the people you've been working with there, but just Rick, any comments about that?
I mean, I think it's kind of obvious that the amount of anthropogenic activity does depend to some extent on the number of people in the world, but nonetheless, we're not going to solve our problem just by reducing population. I mean, I'm not against trying to encourage us to have a little bit more space by having a fewer large families. But nonetheless, that's not going to solve the problem. We've actually got to reduce the emissions that each of us emit, and we may even end up having to remove some of the emissions that we or our forebears have previously emitted if we really want to get over this problem.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. So, and my two penneth is that there is a tried and tested and absolutely cast iron way to reduce populations, and it works everywhere in the world. Doesn't matter if it's a developed country or a developing country. If you just do this one simple thing, you reduce population, and it's educate girls. It works every time in every case. And if I weren't working on climate change, I'd be working on that. So I do think that's an important part of the story. However, as both Gaia and Eric have said, we don't have enough time. We're not going to sit around and wait for populations to fall and say that will solve our problem. We need to be much more active, both in reducing the problem of climate change and also figuring out how to adapt to it. So Rick, Guy was talking about how, we're not hunter-gatherers anymore, and that's one of the reasons that we have a big adaptation challenge. But you have been working at that interface where with societies up in Alaska that are closer to our ancestors, but are also experiencing the modern world. And at the same time, you're also, as an archaeologist, looking at what we can understand about recent societies there. So what are your observations about what we can learn about past experiences for what's happening now?
Well, people in Indigenous Alaska did have those advantages of living in small groups, and small groups that were quick on their feet in terms of decision making, but were also extremely well informed. People underestimate the amount of information it takes to successfully live off the land. It's a tremendous amount of things you have to know to be at the right place at the right time, where animals are going to show up in the numbers that you need in your limited harvest season to bring them in and feed yourself. But a lot of that knowledge still exists, and people do still live in small enough groups where they can arrive at a consensus with really good data behind them, because nobody knows that landscape like they do. That effect, though, is sort of held back, or just by the sheer inertia of outside decision-making systems, large governments and so on, that are reluctant to share power, that aren't as well informed, and so that localized decision-making that was so efficient that got people through climate change, periods of climate change in the past, has been slowed down. Also, the infrastructure is different. It used to be that when there were things in the environment that threatened the location of the village, you just packed up and you built your sod houses in another location. Today, there are about 60 villages in Alaska that are threatened by rising sea levels. They're losing infrastructure and so on, but they just can't pack up and move, because now they're burdened down with things like the airstrip and the water plant and the electrical power plant and all the rest of it. And all those things are controlled by other outside agencies, state and federal agencies, each with their own agenda and so on. So a lot of the traditional processes have been slowed down by their association with the outside.
This is fascinating, Rick, and I'm just wondering if you can unpick, because there's two things going on there. One is access to modern conveniences or modern benefits of life, water treatment or airstrip, the capacity to travel or to bring in goods from elsewhere. It kind of pins down the villages, but also you're talking about how the inability to make local decisions and the inability to have control over your own destiny is part of the issue too. So I can see on one hand, it's the benefits of the 21st century that are pitting people down, and on the other hand, it's the global versus local, and who actually has the agenda and who understands the local situation that could be the problem. How would you unpick those two?
Well, and the key to that is subsistence. It's hard to overstate how important traditional subsistence is, not just to the economy, because of course it's important to economically to live off the land when market foods are so expensive, but as the heart and soul of what amounts to is indigenous senses of identity and a sense of self. The whole year is organized around subsistence rounds. The social framework is organized around sharing subsistence. A lot of the knowledge base that's shared concerns living off the land and in a very local way. And so outside managers try to take advantage of that and get some of that information. But again, it's the power sharing that's lacking. People need to have autonomy over their own subsistence resources. And that's been difficult, especially at a time when there's climate change and these things are at risk. And what's needed is a return to some of these older ways, traditional ways of decision making to the extent possible, because they were extremely efficient. What happened during climate change in prehistoric times is that people would gather together in larger settlements. They would build houses that held more people so they could share information, they could share resources, and make decisions as a people about what to do when things were in rapid flux.
I think this is especially interesting right now, what you're telling us, Rick, because if I'm thinking about the time of COVID, in a way, we've all been forced to go more local than we've been used to being for a really long time. I certainly got pretty tired of these four walls in the past, however many months or decades it's been. It seems like a really long time. But also, I think I'm sensing a bit of a drive towards more of an urge to have local autonomy, maybe even because of that. But citizens' councils talking about climate change, or how can you look at your own local environment and really kind of understand how to adapt in that. And in that context, we've had a really interesting question from somebody. It's quite heartfelt. And it's Joanne Taylor who said this. I live in suburban London and I'm not affected by climate change as many people are around the world. I feel ashamed, but I struggle to care as much as I would like for people who are already being affected. I've wondered if I would help if I had more direct contact with the impact climate change is having, but I can't see how to do this. Do you have any suggestions for how I can experience more compassion for people around the world and hence be more motivated to tackle the issue? So it's a heartfelt question, and it speaks to that. How does it become something that's a local issue and local decision making and local connection, rather than something that feels very far away and hard to connect to? Anyone on that?
Well,
Gaia.
I mean, I can't talk on the empathy side of things, but in terms of climate change affecting, it is affecting us even here. We've had extreme heat, we've had people dying who didn't need to die. The fact that we're still burning fossil fuels, which is raising the temperature, also has a direct, in suburban London, effect on our health because of pollution. And we've had already the first death attributed to air pollution in South London. So in terms of caring about climate change, well, in a way, like, brilliant. If it doesn't bother you, that's amazing, because it keeps me up at night, and I'm glad that you're not troubled by that. For me, it's just horrific. And please bother enough to vote for people for whom climate change is an issue and they're going to do something about it, because really our global leaders need to act and need to restrict fossil fuel companies, corporations that are investing in them, and so on, because this couldn't be more urgent. But I just wanted to pick up something that Rick was talking about earlier, which was really this idea that Indigenous people particularly, but all of us, are exquisitely attuned to our environment, not in the way that other animals are, in that we're totally innately adapted to them. We're adapted in a cultural sense, in that we inherit this incredible cultural knowledge which is passed around our group. And intergenerationally, in that people, for example, a community that lives in the Arctic that we've just been talking about, will be able to read the weather. They'll be able to know at what time to hunt, in which direction of what, how to make the materials they need to survive, which stories are most important in bringing the community together. And this knowledge is incredibly, it is what allows a tropically evolved human to not just survive but thrive in this very hostile and very difficult environment, brilliantly, with these with the same incredibly evolved culture and cultural artifacts, skills, technologies, languages, etc., that enable them to do that. And what we are losing is not just coastlines. We are losing this knowledge, and we're losing this connection to a way of life, of a type of, we're losing this diversity in our human family, our cultural diversity, and that's really important. And it can go really quickly, but it can also be brought. If there's time, I just wanted to tell a very quick story about this. From a Greenland Inuit group, which in the 1820s there was an epidemic, which preferentially, a bit like SARS-CoV, preferentially killed the oldest and most knowledgeable and skilled of the population, the people that held most of the knowledge. And as a result, a lot of cultural knowledge was lost over the consecutive decades, and they didn't know how to make the particular spears that were needed in the next season, and they lost boat building skills and so on. And then they were essentially rescued by a completely different group of Baffin islanders who retaught them the skills of how to make their kayaks, and so their population declined because they had lost this essential knowledge. But from the Baffin islanders, they relearnt some skills, and but it took decades and decades for them to return to their sleeker indigenous canoes, kayaks that they lost. So what I'm saying is that what we keep as a community is very precious, and it's tied, especially for indigenous communities, it's very tied to that environment. And once people can no longer effectively adapt because infrastructure is built up and they become urbanized or move to agriculture or a completely different life, that is gone, and it will be gone forever.
Yeah, so that's actually an aspect of climate change, and when we're talking about how we adapt to it, part of it is how do we preserve that knowledge and the connection, right? And Rick, this is what you were talking about from your archaeological work, that the understanding, the cultural understanding of what came before is disappearing in front of your eyes.
Exactly, and I worry about that too. The loss of diversity. Diversity is all about having choices, and it's the way both cultural systems and natural systems adapt to change. And if you lose that diversity, whether it's cultural, natural, you've lost your ability to roll with those punches. It wouldn't be, climate change is always going to be serious, but this one's especially serious because both of these cultural and natural systems in the Arctic are under such pressure already from a number of things. And so this is an unusual challenge for people. But as an archaeologist, looking at the archaeological record, I'm encouraged in that people do well under pressure. They're at their best under pressure. And if anyone can survive this, the people of the Arctic can, and humans in general can. We're good at this. It's when we're not under pressure that we get sloppy and make mistakes.
I think that's a really good point. And I'd like to bring that back to the question that we had in terms of how to empathize. And really, if you look climate change in the face, it is very terrifying. I don't really recommend it. But what I would say is that in terms of empathy and how is it possible to care about people around the world, and bring that back to the local point as well, I think, we are very adaptive and inventive, and we can find a way out of this if we really try. But at the moment, the world is changing under our feet, both in terms of the climate changes that are happening and in terms of what we're actually needing to do about it. And that can actually be exciting as well as frightening, in terms of the whole transition that we're undergoing. Everything about how we make our energy, everything about how we do business, everything about the whole system around us is going to be changing, and everyone can be part of that. So part of it is to have the empathy of the people that are experiencing this. Part of it is also to realize that a lot of the migration crises that we have directly experienced and have had such a big impact on us geopolitically have actually come originally from climate changes. There was a drought in Syria, there was a drought in the Sahel, Darfur's drought in Guatemala that's triggering a migration crisis there. And so we are already feeling it, even though we don't know. But I would say it's as important to be thinking about how you can be part of this great wave of change that is the solutions, rather than being too frightened with what might otherwise be coming. But anyway, so on that note, we have another couple of questions on the subject of tipping points. And this is something that's come up a few times. If we're trying to avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable. So avoiding the unmanageable is not getting ourselves into a situation where something has tipped over to a place that we can't handle it no matter what. And so a couple of questions have come up. Then one of them is, how do we know we've not passed the tipping point or any tipping points already? We hear about deterioration at an exponential scale, enormous quantities of methane from the melting tundra, etc. So how do we know we haven't passed that tipping point? And there's another question related, which is, are there any examples in the ice record of tipping points being crossed? And what sort of temperature increases could you get on what timescales if that happened? And I think, Eric, that sounds like it's really...
Sounds like mine, doesn't it? Well, firstly, I mean, to answer the second part of the question first, I mean, clearly there are examples in the record of tipping points, because we come out of ice ages into warm periods, and their tipping points, somewhere along the way, it became inevitable that we were going to come out of them, even though the forcing of the climate was still gradual and smooth, just a change in our orbit around the sun, nothing very dramatic that you can see in the curve that's driving it. But suddenly the world got over thousands of years, which is suddenly in the terms that I'm looking at, the Earth got 5 degrees warmer overall, and more than that in some places. So there are certain examples, and we definitely have examples where the ocean circulation I was talking about has tipped from one state to another, where warm water wasn't being brought up to Northern Europe. So how do we know we haven't passed one? Well, we don't know we haven't passed one, but nonetheless, I still say what I said at the beginning, that we want to avoid it, and the best way to avoid passing one is to reduce the amount of climate change that we undertake. I mean, of the ones that are around, I think ice sheets disappearing, causing sea level rise. I think we're pretty sure there are tipping points in the climate system that will cause that to happen. If Greenland warms by, it's uncertain exactly how much, but somewhere between 2 and 5 degrees, you will set it on a course where it keeps melting, because you start to melt it, the altitude lowers as a result of that, which takes it into somewhere warmer, because it gets colder as you go to higher altitude. So as the ice sheet gets smaller, it gets warmer by itself, and it'll just keep going once it's started. So we probably wouldn't want to keep warming at the present rate for another century before we committed Greenland to disappearing with its 6 or 7 meters of sea level. The ocean circulation changing, people are a little bit more sanguine about that than they used to be. They feel it's going to change, that it will slow down, but they no longer feel that it's that probable that in the next century we'll actually shut it down completely in the way that was talked about in, what was that film, where there was a heroic glaciologist.
The Day After Tomorrow.
Yeah, The Day After Tomorrow. My favourite film, because the glaciologist was the hero. The methane, the methane is a difficult one, because it's one where we're divided in the scientific community about the release of methane from permafrost and from subsea deposits. It's certainly, if you warm up the permafrost and the ocean, you will release greenhouse gases, methane and CO2. Whether it can be done really what we would call fast, a bit more doubtful. It takes a long time to get heat into that permafrost down to hundreds of meters, which is where it goes. So I think most of us would feel that's a bad thing. It's a gradual feedback, but it's probably not a tipping point. I don't know. I like to bring a little bit of what I think of as good news, but some people might not.
Yeah, and what I understand about the permafrost, one of the issues about it is that the area is so heterogeneous. The Arctic is so varied in its characteristics that it's very hard to know, to be absolutely sure, hand on heart, at what point this would tip over. And so I think, I certainly heartily support the approach that says, like an insurance policy, we don't want to wait for it to happen and say whoops, because it would be very hard to come back from that. Another interesting question here, which is we do have quite a few questions about stopping climate change, but since this is a panel about adaptation, this is an interesting question, which is, how do you raise the profile of adaptation versus mitigation? Because it's really, it's so, as soon as we think about climate change, we think about how do we stop it getting worse? How do we try to reverse it? And I think we've already said those are important things to do, but how do we make sure that adaptation doesn't disappear in all of that and become a kind of poor relation in the corner? Rick, first of all, do you have any observations about that?
Well, it can't really. You can't, adaptation, it's like climate change is going to be with us. You can't not adapt. There's not much choice there. I mean, it comes with the territory, and we're all adapting right now, whether we know it or not. The whole society is shifting. Just having this conversation is part of adapting. So what people do, they survive in groups, and they get together and they share information. But what's complicating it is the scale, of course. We talked about that earlier, the hunter-and-gatherer societies. You could get people in a room and have the same conversation. And now, even with, we have all these sources of information, we're all reading different books, and we're seldom having the same conversation about the same piece of information. That could change. It could be that and I think we've already seen signs of that. And we're replacing this kind of people in the room with these sort of online forums. Complex systems, whether they're cultural in nature, are all predicated on sharing information, on the exchange of information. And we're getting better at that all the time. So I think that's an important part of our adaptation.
Sure. And Gaia, any other observations on that about really how we raise the profile of adaptation, not just to do it when it's already too late, but to be prepared for it?
I mean, personally, I almost think we don't need to raise the profile of adaptation because it's happening. It's unavoidable. It's absolutely unavoidable. This is what humans do when there's a problem. It needs more money. It needs more, we need to provide more money to the places that need it most. That's a poverty issue, but adaptation, people want to adapt. Have a look, for example, at what has happened just in this last year. I personally would not have believed the incredible societal change, the adaptation that took place because of a pandemic where we all stayed in our homes, we drove much less, we reduced emissions by 7% or maybe 8% globally, which is what we need to do every single year, but without having a pandemic and without having the huge social costs that we've experienced. But that happened not at the barrel of a gun, not because somebody forced us to do it, but because of a community effort. We cooperated together, and that's what we do. We collaborate as a society to meet the challenges of the environment or whatever other of population or whatever the problem is. We collaborate to adapt to that, and we will adapt back.
We do.
We're already massively adapting our energy systems, for example. Again, that's something that's happened so quickly in just such a short period of time. The incredible switch to renewables.
Well, let's not go to renewables. I'm going to challenge you on this. We do adapt, right?
Yeah.
Because it's okay to say we get a crisis and we adapt, but right now we're in the UK, and there's a vaccination program that's going like crazy, and it's all going very well. And there's plenty of countries. I lost count of the last one. I think there's something like 100 countries that haven't had a single vaccine delivered. So it's okay to say we adapt. That's what we do. Okay. But there's emphatically a social justice aspect of this as well.
There is a huge social injustice, but there is also COVAX, which only I think yesterday was approved.
So I'm not saying, I'm not using that. Hang on a sec. So I was using vaccines obviously as an example, as an illustration. But in this particular case, hang on. So in this particular case, what I'm trying to say is, it's not enough to say we adapt, we just adapt. The question is, how can we make sure that climate change, which comes hardest and worse for the poorest people in the world who have the least money to adapt to it, actually get what they need to be able to cope with the changes that they're experiencing? And that's a slightly different question from just letting it happen. And I think this question about how to bring adaptation more onto the scene probably relates to that as well. Any observations on that?
Can I jump in? I think,
sure, please do.
I think adapting to the climate change that's occurring is something that, of course, we'll do. But I think what we're talking about here is what I would call organised adaptation, where we're adapting to what we think is going to occur. And that does require a raised profile and money and attention. I mean, it maybe comes back to that earlier question you had about why I should care. In Britain, adaptation comes down to things like the Thames Barrier and things like that, which are government-style things. But in some countries, the obvious one is Bangladesh, where with sea level rise, they lose half the country. So, that's going to require a lot of adaptation to think about what's going to happen. If we don't do that, then the way that they're going to adapt is by migrating to somewhere else, which leads to wars. So that's not an ideal way of adapting. So
when I was in Bangladesh, I was looking at quite a lot of adaptation that was going on there already. And Bangladesh really is one of the worst hit, like the Arctic. It's one of the very worst hit places. Also, it's low-lying, it's vulnerable to sea level rise, it's also vulnerable to drought, and it's also vulnerable to flooding because it's at the bottom of very major rivers. in Asia. So it's also got an enormous population, but that is population growth is declining. So they're really being hit in all sorts of ways, and they, because of this, have been adapting way before many other countries, and that's been led by Bangladeshis. But of course, that's going to hit an ultimatum. They're literally going to run out of land. And there are a lot of ways that they're trying to deal with that, with you know, floating houses and all that sort of thing. But there is a limit to that, and those people are going to have to migrate, and that is something that we need to talk about, because there is going to be, even if we keep to 1.5 degrees, which will take a huge amount of effort, and let's hope we do, you know, I really hope we do, and then bring our global temperatures down again, it's still going to require an enormous amount of adaptation, and it's going to require those people having homes, and at the moment they face real problems migrating.
So here's a different take now. There's been quite a few questions around this question of young people. There's a question from someone who works as a teacher. As a school teacher, I'm convinced of the power and potential of engaging children and young people to adapt to and help address climate change. Do we know of any case studies where pupils have made a significant impact? And sort of related to that is a question from an artist. I work as an artist, and I'm doing a project with young people based around climate change. What genuine messages of hope do you feel I can pass on to them? And so I'm packaging those questions together to say, the younger you get, it seems the more adaptable you are, but there's also this kind of great burden that's landing on this next generation. So what about what can young people do? Are there any examples of young people actually making a substantial difference, pupils? And also, what message of hope can we give them? Anybody, Rick, Eric?
Can I try for the message of hope? I mean, things are bad. Obviously, climate change is happening, and I think, you know, and answer to your last question of how you raise the profile of adaptation is by admitting that we're probably not going to hit 1.5 degrees. But that's not so hopeful. But on the other hand, on the plus side, if 20 years ago you'd told me that we were going to have more than 50% of our renewables, of our energy of our electricity coming from renewables in Britain today, I wouldn't have believed you. If you told me that wind power was going to be much cheaper than other forms of energy, I wouldn't have believed you. If you told me that people were seriously talking about how to decarbonize totally by 2050, I wouldn't have believed you. So I think that, you know, there is some hope that things are not going to be quite as bad as we thought they were going to be, but that's not to say they're going to be good.
Yeah. Rick?
Well, you know, as a species, we've been through a lot tougher times than this, much tougher. And we've never been as well fed or healthier or as numerous, for better or for worse, as we are now. So it's really so far so good. And one thing we've learned too is that the more minds we have working on a problem, the better solutions we get, and the faster solutions we get, and the more integrated we are as a group of people, the faster we get to innovations, the faster we get to solutions to our problems. So again, that's how we've survived in the past, and there's never been more of us working on a single problem than there is right now. So I think there's reason for hope, and it's also a matter of learning to become proactive rather than reactive. In the past, people aren't very good at being proactive. They react to things. But I think now we're learning, you know, through things like our experience with the pandemic, that nature bats last, and that we can be proactive. You know, we've known for a long time that we might get a pandemic, but had only kind of weakly prepared for it. So maybe this has come at a good time for us to give us a little humility, but at the same time, some confidence in our powers to solve problems.
Sure. Gaia?
Yeah, well, I mean, look at what the children have done. Greta Thunberg's been an absolute global inspiration.
Yeah.
I actually believe that she has, her actions have pushed climate change up the agenda. We already saw a global agreement, which was amazing in 2015 in Paris. We've got a new COP coming this year. people in power are taking this seriously, perhaps late, but every degree of global warming we avoid, there are tipping points that we've discussed, but in terms of avoiding dangerous climate change, it's still possible. This is your world to make. It can be a good anthropocene. It can be a lot better. It can be a lot fairer. And we are changing it already.
Yeah.
And just back to the vaccines, just back to the COVID thing, that is an acute disaster which happened, within a year. This is climate change is a chronic disaster, which is why it's been harder, and it's multifaceted. It's taken us longer to do it. But I mean, it is incredible. In just a year, scientists have come together. We've come up with a solution, and we are making efforts to share these vaccines around. And if we can do it for a disease we can't even see, I really think that we can do something for climate change, which is actually, these storms are already hitting people's lives.
Sure. No, I think that's a brilliant point as well, that although the COVID situation has been acute rather than chronic, a lot of people are telling me, and I work a lot with business, and the businesses, if anything, they've accelerated their actions on climate change rather than reducing them. I thought when COVID hit, that was going to be it for climate for last year. That was supposed to be the big year of climate. And instead, what I've been hearing repeatedly is, no, we're actually accelerating our strategy. And this whole, the race to net zero, which the UN has been spearheading, and the United Nations climate champions, high-level champions. And, it's now become, 18 months ago, nobody was really talking about net zero. And now, if you're not talking about net zero, you're not at the table. And if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So I really think that's something that is a massive message of hope as far as I'm concerned. And when I ask the senior executives that I work with why they're acting, they say it's because of the investors. So the financial world's moving as well. And so, I think we see all these systemic changes and all these realizations that we are actually all in this and need to do something about it. And it feels like those are good changes. And also, I think this experience of COVID, we were talking earlier, Rick, about how it's, if you can make decisions locally, then you can be more adaptable. You can see more opportunities, you can see more solutions. And if it's sort of done at some big distant scale. I remember actually, Eric, one guy who was working in Antarctica at the South Pole in the winter, and he'd get very frustrated with receiving messages from people in the US saying, do this or do that, can you check this? And at one point he said, I said to them, can you feel your fingers right now? Because I can't feel mine right now, so I'm not going to do that. And he put the phone down. But so something about local decision making, something about feeling that you are here in this local area and what you can do about that. I think COVID has enhanced that, and that is part of the climate solution. And also this sense that, just as you were describing the Gaia and the vaccines, the international cooperation, the scientific cooperation that's led to these amazing developments, we need that for climate change, right? So it feels as though this might be kind of helping to push us in that kind of mindset. I mean, Eric,
it's a social tipping point that we need to reach, as well as the
climate ones,
technological, the climate ones. The social tipping point is so important.
Very nice way of putting it. And Eric, I was just thinking, because one of the things that's striking about Antarctica, I know this is kind of focused on the Arctic, but you do have a picture of Antarctica behind you. But in both of the poles, there's an extraordinary level of scientific cooperation across countries that otherwise aren't necessarily friends. And that's produced some extraordinary results as well. So what do you think about how the current mood might help give us more scientific and technological cooperation around the world?
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right that we all cooperate together in the polar regions, because, not least because it's so difficult to get there, that you need to cooperate in order to get to where you want to be. I think there is already a lot of cooperation in science in terms of the science of climate change. It's probably a little bit harder when we come to the technology of reducing climate change, because that's much more in the commercial sector still. I'm not quite sure that it's quite taken off, that this is something where we're all in it together. And adaptation is different again. I mean, the science behind adaptation is inevitably a little local. how you adapt, how you help London to adapt to sea level change is very different from how you're going to help Bangladesh to adapt from sea level to sea level change, for example. So I think there are solutions that need to be spread around, and that's one of the things that people want to do in COP. In the UK, there's a universities network that's trying to have international cooperation as well about discussing solutions both towards mitigation and adaptation. But I think that's a little bit further behind. We're good at understanding the problem, slightly less good at solving it, I'm afraid, despite what we said about human ingenuity.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that it seems like part of the solution is going to have to be that kind of localized decision making and localized connection. And part of the solution has to be this international cooperation and the larger scale connections. And we need to get both of those right to be able to both adapt to this and to fix it. Well, we've still got questions coming in, and thank you, I have to say, to the audience for all these great questions and more. We're coming close to the end of our time now, but we still have time for a little bit more discussion. So I just wanted to ask each of the panelists in turn, given what we've been talking about, but also given your own areas of expertise and the work that you're doing, what do you think the world is going to look like in 2050? Given both our ability to adapt and our ability to challenge climate change, and maybe beyond 2050, if you like, what's the world going to look like over this next 100 years? Who wants to go? Crystal ball time.
Well, I can go.
Go, Gaia.
Well, so, I mean, obviously, it so much depends on what we do right now. And what worries me slightly is a lot of the policy, sorry to mention the P word, but a lot of the policy at the moment is about much longer scale mitigation and adaptation. But really we need to act faster if we want to avoid these very high temperatures. So say by the end of the century we reach, at the moment we're heading for anywhere between 3 and 5 degrees. I mean, that's an incredibly scary prospect. It would be a very, very different world. It would be a world with, for example, in the Arctic, there will be very, very little ice. It will be ice-free summers for sure. We will have reached that much sooner. Most of the major cities in the world will be, by then, because most of them are on the coast, will be severely stressed by coastal erosion, salination. It will be a dangerous place. People will have had to move. They will have had to build either seawalls as an adaptation, or move, or both. I'm hoping we don't get there. So I'm hoping for a much more positive world where we don't exceed 2 degrees, which seems very difficult at the moment, but that is a world where we could all live with enough food, with enough power, and with enough other resources, if we design for it, if we design a world where people can move to safety.
Sure. Eric.
So Guy's already described the two ends of the possible spectrum of outcomes. I mean, the first thing to say is, what's it going to be like in 2050? It's going to be warmer. Whatever way you look at it, it's going to be warmer than it is today. So the question is, how much warmer, and how much legacy of future warming are we still leaving to happen in the following decades to centuries? I can't really say any more than Guy has said about what the options are. In the worst case, it'll be very warm. Guy talked about 5 degrees, which is right on the top end of possible changes, but 5 degrees global warming, that's the difference between the last ice age and today. So it is absolutely a completely different world. 2 degrees, still a lot. It's not 2 degrees from here, it's 2 degrees from where we started. So it's a lot, but it is, as Guy said, manageable for most people. It won't be great. It comes, we have to remember that climate change isn't the only thing happening. I mean, there are other assaults of air pollution that's nothing to do with climate change, of ocean pollution and so on. So what can I answer? Climate change is probably going to make life worse, but other things might make life better. Okay,
we'll go with that. Rick, what's your crystal ball tell you?
Well, I think at any point in time in history, if you had to, anybody who went back in time to describe their world to someone would say, well, some things are better, some things are worse. And I think it's pretty tough right now to predict what will be our biggest concern. You know, it's probably safe to predict we're going to get to sea level rise and the temperature, and that the weather we're experiencing now is as cold as we're ever going to experience. But what we consider the biggest problems might be quite different, because there's a cascade of consequences coming our way. And it's very difficult to predict what's going to be our biggest problem at the time. It may be something that it's not even on our radar right now, some unexpected consequence. On the other hand, I think culturally, we're going to be better off. I think this kind of natural event is just what we needed to keep from driving off a cliff with our not unsustainable lifestyle. So this is the wake-up call that we needed, and I think it's going to move us in the right direction.
Thank you, Rick. I think it's great that you call it a wake-up call, and in a way, you know, we've known all of this. One of the questions that came in is, why are we only talking about this stuff now when we've known about it for decades? And we have known for decades. We've known for decades what the problem is and what we need to do about it. And now at last it feels as if we're mobilizing just when it's almost too late. So that's a kind of message of alarm and a message of hope at the same time. I'm going to take the privilege of the chair and give you my own crystal ball vision, and it actually relates to some of the questions that have come in that I didn't get a chance to ask, but which were a bit more about how we solve climate change rather than how we adapt to it. But, you know, I think that the vision of 5 degrees is very alarming, and we definitely don't want to go there. I don't even like 2 degrees. We've already got super hurricanes, we've already got droughts, we've already got floods, we've already got famines, and we've already got migration, and we do not want to continue with that. So my vision, though, when we solve this, it has a lot of what Rick was talking about and what Gaia was talking about when she said a social tipping point. And when Rick said, you know, we're really good at this. People do best under pressure, he said. If anyone can adapt to this, the people of the Arctic can. And in fact, the people of Earth can, because this is what we're good at. So I think we are good at adapting. We're also good at fixing problems when we really look them in the face. And the way that we'll fix this is by getting a lot better local connections and a lot more grounding in our local region, and also getting lots more international cooperation, refreshing our international institutions, bringing in a whole bunch of different technologies. We had quite a few questions about my own favorite technology at the moment, actually, carbon capture. We had 3 questions about that and how it might come in. And the reason that's one of my favorite technologies is that it gives the opportunity not just to stop the problem getting worse, but actually to start to fix it. And so that's what I'm going to leave you with tonight, my vision, as a vision of hope as well, which is not just about stopping the problem getting worse and dealing with the awful consequences, but getting us as a human race to a place where we can heal the climate, where we can fix a problem, and where we can actually make the earth that we live on better. So that's what we can do. That's the message of hope for young people. And that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. We're going to have to bring this amazing discussion to a close. I do want to thank all of you who've joined us for this and for your questions and for your engagement. You can continue the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag Arctic Exhibition as before. I do encourage you to go and look at all the other digital material on the British Museum website about the Arctic Exhibition. It really is marvellous stuff. And I'd like, of course, to thank our wonderful panel for taking this time and for giving us all of their insights and expertise. Final word is to all of you, we can only solve this together, and we will solve it together. So come and join the fight, and I look forward to seeing you in there. Thanks very much and good night.